If you've watched any World War II aviation video in the last 2 years, you've been told the Japanese called the Beaufighter Whispering Death. You've probably seen 3 other planes called the exact same thing. And here's what nobody checked. A Japanese viewer pointed out that this phrase can't even be constructed in Japanese. It's linguistically impossible. That observation, 12 words in a comment section, generated 602 engagements, the highest performing single comment in the entire dataset of viewer responses to Beaufighter content. It cracked open a myth the English-speaking military history ecosystem has been copy-pasting, unchallenged, for the better part of a decade. No one can trace Whispering Death to any Japanese source. British press copy holds the earliest verifiable use. Even the acoustic explanation, quiet sleeve valve engines, collapses under basic physics. And the content machine that recycled this fabrication, what one viewer with 324 engagements called a sea of AI slop, did so while ignoring a combat record more extraordinary than any manufactured nickname could suggest. The Bristol Beaufighter first flew in July 1939, twin-engine heavy fighter. 2 Bristol Hercules radials producing 1,500 horsepower each, a crew of 2, pilot and navigator, and an airframe versatile enough to serve as long-range fighter, night fighter, ground attack platform, and torpedo bomber across virtually every theatre of the war. By 1940, it was defending Britain in darkness during the Blitz. By 1943, it was leading the destruction of an entire Japanese convoy in the Bismarck Sea. Every one of those roles produced real combat stories worth telling. Almost none of them got told because the content ecosystem was too busy recycling a nickname it never verified. The story, as YouTube tells it, goes something like this. The Beaufighter's Hercules engines used sleeve valves instead of conventional poppet valves, making them unusually quiet. Japanese soldiers in Burma or the Pacific, hearing the aircraft glide in at low altitude with an almost ghostly hush, coined the terrified epithet "Whispering Death" to describe being strafed by something they could barely hear approaching. Technically specific enough to sound credible, emotionally vivid enough to stick, and attributed to a foreign enemy speaking a language almost none of the audience reads, which made it nearly immune to casual verification. The earliest verifiable appearances of the phrase emerge from British press accounts, not from the Pacific Theatre. It appears in 0 Japanese POW interrogation reports, captured field diaries, or post-war Japanese military histories. British wartime press, operating under the guidance of the Ministry of Information, had every institutional incentive to manufacture dramatic nicknames and attribute them to the enemy. An aircraft the Japanese supposedly feared enough to name carries far more propaganda weight than one the RAF's Public Relations Office decided sounded impressive. Attributing a nickname to the enemy transforms a marketing slogan into battlefield testimony. And 80 years later, content creators are still laundering that transformation without checking the receipt. Published books proved no more careful than the YouTube channels they eventually spawned. One aviation history volume states flatly that the Beaufighter's quiet engine earned it the nickname Whispering Death in the Far East. Presented as settled fact, no attribution, no Japanese reference, no source trail of any kind. A separate book, titled Whispering Death, attributes the nickname to an entirely different enemy. The title Whispering Death was the name given by the Germans to the Beaufighter. A third source describes an eerie whistle, later to be nicknamed Whispering Death by the Japanese. 3 published accounts, 3 mutually contradictory versions. Buried in those contradictions sits an acoustic absurdity that reveals the enterprise for what it is. One account claims the aircraft was silent enough to whisper. Another says it produced an audible whistle. Silent and whistling are acoustically opposite qualities, invoked by different authors to justify the same nickname, which means these writers weren't working from a shared primary observation. They were improvising backstories for a phrase they inherited without evidence. And their improvisations couldn't agree on the basic physics of what the aircraft sounded like. When sources contradict themselves at that fundamental level, what you're witnessing is reverse engineering. People constructing explanations to fit a pre-existing conclusion rather than deriving a conclusion from facts. One commenter captured the exhaustion with surgical precision. At least half the Allied aircraft were named Whispering Death. The nickname has been applied to the Beaufighter, the de Havilland Mosquito, the P-38 Lightning, and possibly the Hawker Typhoon. 4 aircraft, 4 manufacturers, 2 continents of operation, 1 nickname, 0 sourcing on any of them. When an identical epithet drifts between 4 unrelated airframes, it has stopped functioning as historical attribution and become a content trope, a floating myth that latches onto whichever aircraft needs dramatizing this week. The replication mechanism behind all of this is straightforward enough to be depressing. A creator reads a book that states the nickname as fact without sourcing it. That claim enters a script. A second creator encounters the nickname in both the resulting video and the original book, concludes it must be true because 2 apparently independent sources confirm it, and repeats it with greater confidence. A third creator, who has never opened a book at all, lifts the claim from the first 2 videos and presents it with the authority of triple confirmation. By the time a single unverifiable assertion from a British press clipping in the 1940s has passed through 3 or 4 intermediaries, it radiates the appearance of established consensus. Nobody in the chain checked. Nobody needed to, because the platform rewards speed and volume over accuracy. A sea of AI slop. Those 5 words earned 324 engagements because they diagnosed an illness the audience had been suffering for years. The label captures more than AI-generated voiceovers. It describes an environment where verification has been replaced by repetition, and repetition mistaken for evidence. Viewers in this audience can identify a lazy script from a single mispronounced term. Lieutenant instead of lieutenant, a flat rendering of a mark designation, and one described actively deleting channels from their subscriptions over exactly that kind of carelessness. Another flagged suspicion of any content that felt too neat, assembled by algorithm rather than by someone who cared whether the words were true. These enthusiasts watched the Whispering Death myth replicate across dozens of channels without variation, without scrutiny, for years. They noticed long before the creators did. The myth's defenders have one genuinely credible piece of technical ammunition, and the underlying physics is real. Bristol Hercules engines used a sleeve valve design rather than conventional poppet valves. In automotive applications, sleeve valves were demonstrably quieter. No tappets, no rocker arms, none of the mechanical clatter associated with poppet valves cycling at high speed. Sleeve valve car engines possessed a distinctive smoothness that luxury marques prized. And a viewer made precisely this point, earning 27 engagements for a technically accurate observation. At low RPM, in controlled conditions, sleeve valves produce measurably less mechanical noise than poppet valves. The engineering distinction is genuine. The physics holds up. What doesn't hold up is the leap from a luxury car engine idling in a Surrey driveway to a radial aero engine at full attack power over a Burmese jungle. A viewer with deep technical knowledge stated the physics plainly. The valves contribute very little to noise. The noise comes from residual pressure of still expanding hot gases. That observation is accurate and fatal to the myth. The dominant noise source in any internal combustion engine at high power output isn't valve clatter, it's exhaust noise. The violent, continuous expulsion of hot, high-pressure combustion gases through the exhaust system, overwhelming every other acoustic source by a wide margin. In a radial aero engine like the Hercules, those gases exit through open exhaust stubs, short, entirely unsilenced pipes designed to extract maximum thrust from the departing gas column. No mufflers soften the report. No resonators smooth the signature. Cylinders firing in rapid succession dump spent combustion gases directly into the slipstream through a few inches of steel, and at full throttle the result is a sustained, chest-compressing roar, audible from miles away on the ground. A second viewer reinforced the physics. How could anyone ever hear the valve gear over the roar of open exhaust stubs at attack power? They couldn't. At combat power settings, throttles push to the stops, a Beaufighter screaming in at mast height, the sleeve valve advantage becomes acoustically invisible. Exhaust noise swamps any valve gear differential by orders of magnitude. Claiming the Beaufighter crept up silently because its valve mechanism was marginally quieter is like claiming a particular tyre brand makes a lorry hushed on the motorway because it squeaks less in a car park. The sleeve valve defence was the strongest card in the myth's hand, and it has been presented here at full strength because the prosecution must never strawman. Sleeve valves genuinely are quieter. The automotive evidence is solid. The engineering distinction is real. But a luxury car at idle and two radial aero engines in a strafing run occupy entirely different acoustic realities. At maximum power, with open exhaust stubs hammering the air and four 20mm cannon firing, the difference between sleeve valves and poppet valves dissolved into the general thunder. Provenance and acoustics had already gutted the myth. The third line of evidence struck from the one direction nobody in the English-speaking content world had thought to look, because nobody had thought to ask a Japanese person. I simply couldn't imagine how we would say such terms in Japanese. 602 engagements on that single sentence. A native Japanese speaker addressing the claim that Japanese forces coined "whispering death" offered an observation so fundamental it exposed how little anyone had interrogated the attribution. The compound phrase doesn't work in Japanese. English handles whispering death effortlessly, a participial adjective modifying an abstract noun. 7 syllables of instant drama. Japanese compound noun formation follows entirely different morphological rules. The word for whisper is sasayaki. The word for death is shi. Welding them into sasayaki no shi, or any analogous construction, produces nothing that sounds like a natural Japanese expression, military or otherwise. The poetic metaphorical style that English speakers imagine, a hushed literary epithet born of terror on a jungle battlefield, falls outside the conventions of how Japanese forces designated enemy equipment. Japanese military culture maintains systematic frameworks for identifying Allied aircraft, frequently borrowing Allied code names or using phonetic adaptations rather than coining florid English-style epithets that would need to be translated backward from London press copy to function in the source language. For decades, English-language aviation books, documentaries, and YouTube channels repeated the claim that the Japanese coined this phrase. None of them appear to have consulted a Japanese language source, a Japanese military historian, or a native speaker with basic linguistic competence. An entire content ecosystem attributed a phrase to the Japanese language without ever verifying whether the Japanese language could accommodate it. Intellectual honesty demands a caveat. The 602 engagement comment is a single viewer's observation, and it carries outsized analytical weight as a single data point. That must be acknowledged plainly, because this audience respects nothing less than transparency about the limits of evidence. But the comment arrived alongside a surrounding cluster of myth-busting responses, addressing acoustics, the multiple aircraft attribution, absent primary sources, that generated roughly 676 combined engagements across 5 separate threads. The Japanese viewer didn't invent the doubt. The doubt had been building in fragments across comment sections for years. What the comment did was crystallize it into something the defenders couldn't wave away. 3 vectors converge on the same verdict. Provenance. The trail leads to British press offices and stops cold, with 0 Japanese documentation supporting the attribution. Linguistics. A native speaker states the phrase can't be naturally formed in Japanese, and no one has refuted the claim. Acoustics. The mechanism supposedly explaining the nickname is physically irrelevant at combat power. Each argument carries independent weight. Together, they close the case. Whispering death, as attributed to the Japanese, was almost certainly a British press invention, laundered through decades of uncritical repetition until it hardened into the appearance of historical fact, then fed into the content machine where it became the most repeated claim about the Bristol Beaufighter. And the least examined. A Japanese convoy of 8 transport ships and 8 destroyers was pushing through the Bismarck Sea, heading for Lae, New Guinea. Aboard those transports, approximately 6,900 troops of the 51st Division, reinforcements for a garrison whose position was deteriorating by the week. General George Kenny, commanding Allied air forces in the southwest Pacific area, had been tracking the convoy since it departed Rabaul. Kenny had spent weeks drilling his air crews in the low-altitude attack tactics he believed could annihilate a convoy, provided weather cooperated and the geometry held. March 2nd brought conventional punishment. B-17 flying fortresses struck from high altitude in classic formation bombing, the kind of attack Japanese naval commanders understood intimately. B-17 scored hits and sunk 1 transport, but the core of the convoy pressed on through the night, battered, still functional, still heading for Lae. Japanese destroyer captains had absorbed the punishment and survived. High-altitude bombing gave ships time to maneuver, time to spread formations, time to ride out attack patterns that arrived with visible lead time. Those captains had every reason to expect a repetition on March 3rd. Heavy bombers coming in high, the same familiar window to evade. March 3rd broke over the Bismarck Sea under low grey cloud, and what emerged from beneath it bore no resemblance to anything the convoy had survived the day before. Beaufighters of No. 30 Squadron RAAF came in first. They came at mast height, and that phrase should be taken literally. At the level of the ship's superstructures, so low that sea spray kicked up behind the aircraft, so close to the water that Japanese anti-aircraft gunners physically couldn't depress their weapons fast enough to track targets screaming past at eye level. Kenny's weeks of preparation had produced a sequenced attack built around a specific vulnerability: the gap between the moment anti-aircraft batteries were destroyed and the moment the bombers arrived to exploit that silence. 4 20mm Hispano cannon and 6.303 Browning machine guns, all concentrated in the nose, converted each Beaufighter into a flying battery. At ranges under 100 yards, point blank at aircraft closing speeds, That volume of fire swept exposed crew from gun positions, shredded deck equipment, and, critically, suppressed the anti-aircraft batteries that represented the convoy's only defense against what arrived seconds later. A-20 Havocks and B-25 Mitchells followed, armed for skip bombing. The technique demanded extraordinary nerve. Release bombs at extremely low altitude, barely above the wave tops, so the weapons skipped across the water's surface before slamming into ship hulls at or below the waterline. Against active anti-aircraft fire, skip bombing was close to suicidal. The aircraft had to fly low and slow on their bomb runs, turning into sitting targets for any battery still in action. The Beaufighters had already ripped those guns apart. Bombers flew into the gap the strafing runs created, and their ordnance found hulls that no longer had functioning batteries to protect them. All 8 transports and 4 of the 8 destroyers were sunk. Thousands of Japanese soldiers died, many in the water after their transports went down, strafed in subsequent attack waves, in scenes that remain among the most controversial episodes of the Pacific theatre. Japan never attempted another major troop convoy to New Guinea after the Bismarck Sea. One battle ended a logistics strategy for an entire theatre of war. Beaufighters led the opening assault. A viewer who watched a Beaufighter video that omitted this entirely came to the comments to say, "What? No Bismarck Sea?" The content ecosystem passed over the most consequential Beaufighter operation of the war, a battle that altered the strategic balance across the Southwest Pacific in favor of a fabricated nickname about quiet engines. The Bismarck Sea alone would fill a documentary, but a quieter statistic cuts deeper into whether the Beaufighter needed any mythologizing at all. Across the entire Second World War, the Beaufighter ranked as the RAF's 3rd highest scoring fighter type for air-to-air kills, behind the Spitfire and Hurricane, ahead of the Mosquito. That ranking spans night fighter operations during the Blitz of 1940 and 1941, when radar-equipped Beaufighters were among the only aircraft capable of finding and destroying German bombers in total darkness. It encompasses operations from the Mediterranean to Burma and deep into the Pacific. Across all those roles and every theatre, the Beaufighter accumulated more confirmed air-to-air victories than the de Havilland Mosquito. Slightly more, but more. That comparison demands respect for both aircraft. The Mosquito was faster, certainly, more refined in its aerodynamics without question, and rightly celebrated by historians. Telling a Mosquito partisan that the Beaufighter edged their aircraft in air-to-air kills is the aviation equivalent of showing a sports car owner their lap time was beaten by a truck. The numbers don't resolve the broader debate over which was the finer aircraft, and nothing ever will. But did the Beaufighter need a fabricated nickname to earn its place in the record? Its kill sheet answered that decades ago. The aircraft also carried a lethal aerodynamic flaw that killed its own crews before they reached combat. Engine torque created vicious yaw instability during takeoff. 2 massive Hercules radials, both spinning their propellers in the same rotational direction, generated a torque reaction that forced the entire airframe to swing the opposite way. At the worst possible phase of flight, low speed during the ground roll, the aircraft heavy with fuel and ammunition, fully committed with no altitude for recovery, the Beaufighter would lurch hard off its heading. Pilots who couldn't catch the swing instantly, or who ran out of rudder authority before speed built enough for aerodynamic control to bite, departed the concrete at speed, often cartwheeling in a disintegrating fireball before ever reaching flying speed. Training units bore the worst of it. Pilots who applied corrective rudder a fraction of a second too late found themselves watching the runway edge whip past the canopy, the aircraft beyond recovery. Modifications that eventually addressed the problem. An enlarged fin and dorsal fillet fitted to later production marks, improved directional stability. But those fixes arrived after a toll had already been extracted from crews who trained on earlier airframes that lacked them. Men died on airfields, in training, hundreds of miles from any enemy, killed by the aerodynamics of the machine they'd been assigned to master. Replacing one myth with another, swapping whispering death for sanitized hero worship, would reproduce exactly the kind of lazy content this prosecution exists to challenge. The Beaufighter's combat record is extraordinary. Its training accident record belongs in the same history, reported with the same rigor. Danger didn't end once crews reached operational squadrons. In the Pacific, the Beaufighter's twin-engine silhouette created a different kind of threat, one originating behind friendly lines. A navigator reported being shot at 5 or 6 times during his tour. 3 of those instances, the fire came from Americans. The Beaufighter's twin-engine configuration and general plan form bore a passing resemblance to certain Japanese twin-engine types, like the Kawasaki Ki-45 Toryu. At a distance, at speed, in the confusion of an active combat zone, trigger-happy crews saw twin engines approaching low and opened fire before positive identification. The problem recurred with enough regularity that Beaufighter crews operating near areas with heavy American ground or naval presence lived under an additional layer of risk no tactical planning could fully eliminate. These men flew missions knowing the Japanese ahead wanted them dead, the aircraft beneath them might kill them during takeoff, and their own allies below sometimes tried to kill them by mistake. Each sortie compounded those risks across years of combat that spanned the frozen darkness over wartime Britain and the humid, low-altitude killing grounds of the Southwest Pacific. Their aircraft was devastating and deeply flawed, feared by the enemy and occasionally shot at by friends. That tension, brilliance alongside genuine danger from every direction, is what real history looks like. It's exactly the texture that the content machine strips away when chasing a clean, algorithmically optimized narrative. The whispering death myth survived 80 years because it was elegant, because it was dramatic, and because checking it required effort neither publishers nor content creators were willing to invest. British press officers in the 1940s understood how to write a compelling line. Enemy forces have given this aircraft a terrified nickname. Plays better in print than our public relations department thought this sounded good. Attributing it to the enemy was the rhetorical trick that made it stick. Through decades of aviation books, through the documentary wave of the 1990s, and into the YouTube era where repetition replaced verification entirely. A Japanese viewer, writing in English in a comment section that algorithms rarely surface and creators rarely read, quietly demolished the entire structure with one observation. I simply couldn't imagine how we would say such terms in Japanese. Nobody in the English-speaking military history world had ever thought to ask. The Beaufighter didn't need whispering death. Third highest air-to-air scorer in the entire RAF. Annihilator of a Japanese convoy at the Bismarck Sea. A battle that ended an enemy logistics strategy for a whole theatre of war. A heavy fighter that served from the Blitz to Burma and outscored the Mosquito in the air-to-air count. The genuine record was always more compelling than the myth. Nobody bothered to tell that story, because checking sources is harder than copying a nickname, and a dramatic thumbnail outperforms a documented fact on every platform metric that exists. Next time someone tells you a fact about World War II aviation, ask where they got it. Ask whether anyone checked. Because across a decade of content about the Bristol Beaufighter, the answer was almost always no. Subscribe if you want more stories built on evidence instead of recycled myths.